I've never actually self-hosted GitLab before. What is like the actual process of doing that? How, like, people will say GitLab's kind of heavy as opposed to things like Gitty and things like that. I don't know if you've ever messed with those before, but like how easy is it to set up your own GitLab?
Not easy. They have a Docker container,
Uh-huh.
and that's kind of the recommended way to install it. But even then, that's just to get GitLab, like the Git server, running. So you get your web interface and your SSH and stuff like that, and the ability to store repositories and clone and all that stuff, all the Git stuff.
Right.
That is relatively simple. You just get your server, preferably a beefy one, because it is heavy. They're not lying. 4 gigs of RAM minimum. I think 2 cores minimum, and like it needs a decent amount of disk space if you're doing anything useful with it.
Sure.
But other than that, it's just your standard, exposing the right ports, probably putting it behind a reverse proxy or Cloudflare or stuff like that, getting certificates, getting a domain name, the usual self-hosting stuff you have to do. But that's just for Git, the base GitLab. There are 2 other components to it that I also have, and there is GitLab Pages, which is like GitHub Pages, but for GitLab, and not a lot of people use GitLab Pages compared to GitHub Pages.
I literally am just finding out it existed right
now. And it's a similar sort of idea. There's multiple ways you can configure it, but it's a lot harder to set up than the base GitLab. And then there is GitLab Container Registry, which I also use, which is what allows you to host your own Docker containers as images that people can just download. I don't like polluting third-party websites or centralized repositories of my stuff, especially if I don't know if I'm going to keep that stuff around. So, like, I don't publish to Docker Hub because I don't want to pollute it.
That makes sense.
So I have my own container registry. And the reason these things are complicated is because each one of them needs its own domain name or subdomain. And in GitLab Pages case, depending on how you set it up, you need a separate static IP address altogether for it. And it involves manual networking and money.
I see. So,
yeah.
If you were to just for what you're doing, I don't know if you want to say how much, like, the setup you've got going on costs, like, because I imagine that's sort of like minimum viable product, right? Like, you're not trying to host something like a free desktop where tons of other people are using it. It's pretty much just, like, for your product, and that's it.
Okay, so, I obviously don't have, like, a massive cluster of servers like they do. I have one beefy server. This is a video game, so it needs to do video game things, and it's also a program that needs to do unit testing and stuff like that. So I do need the RAM, and I do need the cores, and I do need, at minimum, a graphics card that can do OpenGL. It doesn't need to be a beefy one, because it's not a AAA game, it's a hacking game. But it does need a graphics card so that I can actually bootstrap SDL and get everything running. And so I have a Hetzner server auction box. It's got an Intel Core i7 6700, I think, which is a 4-core processor running multi-threading, so 4 cores, 8 threads. Decently fine for what I use. And 64 gigs of DDR4 RAM, which sounds like a lot for what I'm doing, but when you get a lot of GitLab CI/CD runners going, and because when you're self-hosting, you have to bring them yourself. You don't just automatically get them. That's stuff you have to provide the hardware. So, once you get a lot of those running, the RAM usage is going to kick up pretty fast. So it's good to have. And then it's got an Intel HD 630 in it, I think, for the integrated graphics card. So not something that you can play Cyberpunk 2077 on, but at the same time,
well, you can try. I wouldn't recommend it.
You can try it. It might run at 1 frame per year. But it should run socially distant fine, and that'll be enough for testing and making sure that, like, I can write code that says, hey, click this button, see what it does, and does it do what you expect? Stuff like that. So that's good. And then other than that, it's just storage. It's got 8 terabytes of storage on it, which, if you're hosting GitLab, you kind of need storage. So, and the reason I say that hardware is what it is because it costs me, I believe, $60 a month Canadian for that one server.
Okay.
So it's a bit much, but it is partially covered by my lovely Patreon supporters. So, I can afford to do it, and it'll make my life a little easier. So I didn't really see a point not to upgrading to that. Plus, the old server is just a crappy gaming computer that I had, or that I built 10 years ago, and it was barely good at gaming when it was new, and I've upgraded it since then, and it still struggles to run GitLab. So,
why did you decide to actually go and move off of your self-hosting stuff? What was your old setup not doing for you?
Okay, so my old setup, even though I was hosting the actual server at home, the home part of it was the problem, because we're on gigabit fiber, which is great. It's great for
that would be nice,
use, but the problem with it is we don't have a static IP. We have a dynamic IP, and you actually want a dynamic IP as a residential network, because if someone grabs your IP through some exploit in a video game, you just reboot your router, and they can't do anything with it other than maybe some coarse geolocation. But
not even just that. They're not going to be able to have. If you're torrenting something and you're a public seeder, that's gonna expose your IP address. There's so many. If you go to a website and they keep IP logs, and then that website has a data leak, there are so many ways your IP address can just get out there. And having one that's just changing is there's no. Well, firstly, there's a minimal. Especially if we're talking IPv4, there's only a minimal set of IP addresses. So having home addresses be static just isn't really viable anymore. And there's too many ways for it to be leaked.
The downside, however, is most things you self-host kind of need a static IP, because you need a dedicated IP that the internet knows where to reach you at. And there are ways around that. You can do dynamic DNS, or you can set up a Cloudflare daemon on your server to basically figure out what your new home IP address is and do some API magic. No, I don't want to deal with that. I just want my stuff to work. So what I did is infinitely more complicated in true Richie fashion. I rented a $5 per month VPS through a local VPS provider. And I set it up as a WireGuard host, and that became my static IP. So
I guess that works, yeah.
So it works. The problem is now so not only do you need Cloudflare, in case, you want the CDN caching, stuff like that for static assets, but you need an Nginx reverse proxy that sits on the VPS with the static IP, and that routes your traffic through WireGuard into your home network to GitLab or Nextcloud or whatever you're hosting. So if I go set up Nextcloud, for example, I don't follow the normal, here's what you do to get it working instructions. I have to follow agony. I have to actually learn what's going on and figure out how to get it working under the reverse proxy and through WireGuard and stuff like that, and it's a nightmare. And it's a single point of failure. If someone DDoS's that VPS, all my stuff falls off the internet. If I stop paying for that VPS, it falls off the internet.
Yeah, that's a that's an approach. Look, you could argue that it's not horrible because it's a learning experience and you have a deeper understanding of how networking functions.
Yeah.
But
unwiring that mess to something sane. Well, now you know why I have SSL errors.
Yeah. Okay.